For over 1700 years, they had one mission: erase her from history, delete every trace, burn every manuscript, silence every voice that dared speak her name. But what if I told you that despite their best efforts, despite centuries of systematic suppression, the truth about the most dangerous woman in Christian history has survived? What if the most important woman in Christianity wasn't the Virgin Mary, but a daughter whose very existence threatens the foundation of institutional religion as we know it? A daughter whose bloodline carries secrets so profound that entire empires were built to hide her legacy. Tonight, you're about to discover why her name was whispered in shadows, why her story was buried beneath layers of doctrine, and why powerful men trembled at the mere mention of her existence. This isn't just another biblical mystery. This is the revelation that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity. Have you ever felt, deep in your soul, that something fundamental was missing from the story you were told? That nagging sense that the official narrative was incomplete, sanitized, deliberately crafted to hide something magnificent and terrifying. If you've ever questioned why certain books were excluded from the Bible, why certain voices were silenced, why the feminine divine was systematically erased from our spiritual heritage, then what you're about to hear will validate every instinct you've ever had. For centuries, scholars have debated, theologians have argued, historians have speculated. But tonight we're going beyond speculation. We're examining preserved manuscripts, ancient traditions, archaeological whispers, and cultural memories that have survived despite the most systematic campaign of suppression in human history. The woman at the center of this revelation wasn't just any woman. She wasn't a follower, a supporter, or a silent witness. According to traditions preserved by communities who risked everything to maintain these memories, she was the daughter of the most explosive union in human history, the sacred partnership between Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. But before you dismiss this as fantasy or fiction, understand this: what you're about to discover isn't based on novels or Hollywood movies. It's rooted in manuscripts discovered in Egyptian caves, preserved in the cultural memory of ancient communities, whispered through generations of believers who understood that some truths are too powerful to speak aloud, too dangerous to record in official documents, too revolutionary to survive in mainstream religion. Think about this for a moment. If Jesus was fully human, as most Christian denominations teach, then why would marriage and family be impossible for him? In first-century Jewish culture, an unmarried rabbi in his 30s would have been virtually unthinkable. Marriage wasn't just normal, it was expected, commanded, seen as a spiritual duty. Yet somehow we're asked to believe that the most human of all humans never experienced the most fundamental human relationships. What if that's not because he chose celibacy, but because acknowledging his family would have complicated the political and theological structure that developed after his death? What if there were children, descendants, a bloodline that carried both human and divine heritage? And what if the most significant of these descendants was a daughter whose very existence posed an existential threat to patriarchal religious power? The name preserved in ancient traditions is Sarah, Sarah Lakali, Sarah the Black, Sarah the Egyptian, a name carried through generations by communities who understood her significance even when they couldn't speak it openly. A daughter who, according to preserved accounts, inherited not just her father's spiritual gifts, but her mother's strength, wisdom, and revolutionary understanding of divine love. Tonight, we're going to trace her story, from the manuscripts that hint at her existence, through the escape routes that carried her to safety, to the communities that protected her memory for over 2 millennia. We'll examine why her story was so dangerous that it required the combined might of imperial Rome and institutional Christianity to suppress it. But more than that, we'll explore what her story means for you right now in this moment of global awakening, when so many people are questioning official narratives, seeking authentic spiritual connection, and reclaiming truths that were stolen from our collective consciousness. Because this isn't just ancient history, this is about the recovery of the feminine divine, the restoration of sacred partnership, the healing of artificial divisions between spirit and flesh, between heaven and earth, between masculine and feminine principles that were meant to work in harmony, not opposition. Are you ready? Are you prepared to have everything you thought you knew about Christianity challenged, expanded, and ultimately transformed? Because once you see the truth about Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter, Once you understand why her existence was so threatening that it required centuries of suppression, you'll never look at religious authority the same way again. The suppression begins with understanding who Mary Magdalene really was, not the repentant prostitute of popular imagination, but a woman of such spiritual power and political influence that her memory had to be systematically destroyed. And it continues with understanding why a daughter carrying both her mother's wisdom and her father's divine connection represented the greatest threat imaginable to men who wanted to control access to the sacred. What you're about to discover has been preserved by communities who understood that truth is more powerful than persecution, that love is stronger than empire, that the authentic message of divine unity and sacred partnership cannot be permanently silenced, no matter how many books are burned, how many voices are suppressed, how many centuries of propaganda are constructed to hide it. This is their story. This is her story. This is the truth about the daughter they thought they had erased from history forever. To understand why a daughter had to be erased from history, we must first understand the systematic campaign that created Christian orthodoxy as we know it. This wasn't a gradual evolution of belief. It was a deliberate construction project that required the elimination of competing voices, alternative scriptures, and especially the suppression of feminine spiritual authority. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. When Emperor Constantine convened bishops from across the Roman Empire, he wasn't seeking spiritual truth, he was engineering political unity. The empire was fracturing along religious lines, and Constantine needed a single centralized version of Christianity that could serve imperial interests. But here's what they don't teach in theology classes. The council didn't just decide which books belonged in the Bible. They systematically identified and targeted for destruction any text, tradition, or community that presented Jesus as anything other than the celibate, otherworldly figure that served their political needs. This meant eliminating any reference to his human relationships, his marriage, his children, and especially any suggestion that spiritual authority could be transmitted through bloodline rather than institutional hierarchy. Historical records suggest that thousands of manuscripts were destroyed during this period. Not just heretical texts, but entire libraries that preserved alternative accounts of Jesus' life and ministry. Communities that maintained different traditions were scattered, their leaders executed or exiled, their sacred texts confiscated and burned. The targeting of feminine spiritual authority was particularly systematic. Early Christian communities had included numerous women in leadership roles, not just as supporters or followers, but as teachers, prophets, and spiritual authorities in their own right. The Montanist movement, for example, was led by women who claimed direct prophetic revelation. Gnostic communities frequently recognized the spiritual equality of women and men. All of this had to be eliminated to create the patriarchal structure that could serve imperial interests. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to prostitute represents perhaps the most successful character assassination in human history. A woman who, according to canonical Gospels, was the first witness to the resurrection, who financially supported Jesus' ministry, who was specifically named as someone Jesus loved, was systematically reimagined as a reformed sex worker whose only significance was her repentance. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By transforming the most prominent woman in Jesus' inner circle into a symbol of sexual sin and redemption, Church Fathers accomplished several goals simultaneously. They eliminated a powerful female role model, reinforced the association between women and sexual temptation, and created a narrative that positioned male religious authority as necessary for women's spiritual salvation. But the suppression went deeper than individual character assassination. Entire theological concepts had to be eliminated. The Gnostic understanding of Sophia, divine wisdom personified as feminine, was systematically eradicated. The concept of sacred marriage, of spiritual partnership between masculine and feminine principles, was replaced with mandatory celibacy for religious leaders and the demonization of sexuality itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christian communities were far more diverse in their beliefs and practices than Orthodox history admits. Discoveries at Nag Hammadi revealed entire libraries of texts that present radically different understandings of Jesus' message, his relationships, and his spiritual teachings. These weren't fringe beliefs. they were mainstream in many early Christian communities. The Gospel of Mary, for example, presents Mary Magdalene as Jesus' closest disciple, the one to whom he revealed his most profound teachings. The Gospel of Philip describes their relationship in terms that strongly suggest marriage and intimate spiritual partnership. The Gospel of Truth speaks of divine love in ways that affirm both physical and spiritual union as paths to sacred understanding. All of these texts had to be eliminated, hidden, or destroyed to create the version of Christianity that could serve imperial power. The process took centuries and required the combined force of church and state. Communities that preserved alternative traditions were systematically persecuted. The Cathars, the Templars, various Gnostic groups, all were eliminated not just for political reasons but because they maintained memories of a different Christianity, one that included the sacred feminine, honored spiritual partnership, and recognized that divine authority could exist outside institutional control. This systematic suppression explains why the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter had to be erased. A child carrying both human and divine heritage, raised by a mother who was herself a spiritual teacher and leader, represented everything the imperial church needed to eliminate: feminine spiritual authority, the continuation of divine bloodline outside institutional control, and living proof that Jesus' most profound relationships were with women who were his equals, not his followers. The daughter wasn't just a threat to theological doctrine, she was a threat to the entire power structure that was being constructed. If Jesus had children, if his spiritual legacy was transmitted through family rather than institutional hierarchy, if women could inherit and transmit divine authority, then the whole edifice of patriarchal religious control would crumble. If you're ready to uncover what they spent centuries trying to hide, this channel is your gateway to forbidden knowledge. Subscribe now, because in the coming minutes, you'll discover evidence so compelling that it might change everything you believed about early Christianity. We're not just sharing information here, we're reclaiming stolen heritage, recovering suppressed truths, and rebuilding understanding that was deliberately shattered. Don't let this truth slip away. Join thousands who are already awakening to these hidden realities. The journey we're taking together challenges everything we've been taught, and every video builds upon the last to reveal a more complete picture of our spiritual heritage. To understand the daughter, we must first understand the mother, whose true identity was one of history's most successful cover-ups. Mary Magdalene wasn't the repentant prostitute of church tradition. She was a woman of extraordinary spiritual power, political influence, and sacred wisdom, whose real story was so threatening that it required complete reimagining. The canonical Gospels themselves, even after centuries of editing and revision, preserve evidence of Mary Magdalene's true significance. In the Gospel of Luke, she's specifically named as one of the women who provided for them out of their resources, indicating not just financial independence, but substantial wealth that supported Jesus' entire ministry. This wasn't a marginalized woman, this was someone with significant economic and social power. The Gospel of John presents even more remarkable evidence. Mary Magdalene is the first person to encounter the risen Jesus, and she's given the responsibility of announcing the resurrection to the apostles. In a culture where women's testimony wasn't legally valid, the choice to make a woman the primary witness to Christianity's central miracle suggests either historical accuracy, too strong to edit out, or a level of spiritual authority that transcended social conventions. But it's in the non-canonical texts, the manuscripts discovered at Nag Hammadi and other sites, that we see the full scope of Mary Magdalene's role in early Christianity. The Gospel of Mary, dating to the 2nd century, presents her not as a follower, but as a teacher, someone to whom Jesus revealed mysteries he didn't share with the male disciples. When Peter questions her authority, other disciples defend her, saying Jesus loved her more than any of them. The Gospel of Philip goes even further, describing the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene in terms that clearly indicate intimate partnership. The text speaks of Jesus kissing Mary frequently and notes that the other disciples were troubled by this special relationship. These aren't later romantic fantasies. These are early Christian texts that preserve memories of relationships the Orthodox tradition worked to erase. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to corroborate these textual hints. Excavations in 1st century Palestine have revealed evidence of women serving in religious leadership roles that were later eliminated from official history. Inscriptions and artwork from early Christian communities show women performing priestly functions, leading worship, and being honored as spiritual authorities. Some scholars propose that Mary Magdalene may have been what first-century Judaism called a prophetess, a woman recognized as having direct divine communication and the authority to interpret spiritual matters. This would explain both her prominence in the Gospel accounts and the systematic effort to eliminate her from later church tradition. The name Magdalene itself provides clues to her identity. While traditionally interpreted as meaning from Magdala, some linguistic analysis suggests it could derive from words meaning tower or elevated, possibly indicating a title rather than a place of origin. If this interpretation is correct, Mary the Tower would suggest someone recognized as a spiritual pillar, a foundation figure in early Christianity. Cultural traditions preserved in various communities maintain that Mary Magdalene was not only Jesus' spiritual partner, but also someone who possessed independent spiritual authority and divine connection. These traditions, passed down through generations, despite systematic suppression, describe her as a teacher in her own right, someone who understood divine mysteries and transmitted them to carefully chosen successors. The transformation of this powerful spiritual figure into a repentant prostitute represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. By reimagining Mary Magdalene as a fallen woman redeemed through male spiritual authority, Church Fathers eliminated a powerful alternative model of feminine spiritual leadership while reinforcing narratives that positioned women as inherently sinful and in need of male guidance. But preserved traditions suggest that Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority wasn't derived from her relationship with Jesus. It was inherent, recognized by him as equal to his own. Some communities maintain that she possessed what Gnostic traditions called gnosis, direct, unmediated spiritual knowledge that transcended institutional teaching and conventional religious authority. This understanding of Mary Magdalene as an independent spiritual authority makes her potential role as mother even more significant. A woman who possessed divine wisdom in her own right, who was recognized as a spiritual teacher and leader, who understood sacred mysteries and transmitted them to others, would naturally raise children who inherited not just their father's spiritual gifts, but their mother's wisdom and authority. The systematic suppression of Mary Magdalene's true identity becomes even more crucial when we consider what it meant for her children's legacy. If she was merely a reformed sinner grateful for redemption, then her offspring would have no particular spiritual significance. But if she was a spiritual authority in her own right, a teacher and wisdom keeper, a woman who possessed divine connection independent of male mediation, then her children, especially a daughter who might inherit and continue her spiritual lineage, would represent an existential threat to patriarchal religious control. Understanding who Mary Magdalene really was illuminates why the story of her daughter had to be erased. This wasn't just about eliminating inconvenient family relationships. It was about destroying evidence of feminine spiritual authority that existed independent of institutional control, that could be transmitted through bloodline rather than ordination, that challenged the fundamental power structures being constructed in early Christianity. The discovery of hidden manuscripts in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi in 1945 represents one of the most significant archaeological finds in modern history. 13 leather-bound codices, buried sometime in the 4th century, preserved texts that official Christianity had worked for centuries to eliminate. Among these forbidden gospels were documents that shed remarkable light on the relationships, teachings, and family life of Jesus, including tantalizing hints about children who carried his spiritual legacy. The Gospel of Mary, one of the most significant texts in this collection, presents Mary Magdalene as the disciple closest to Jesus, the one to whom he revealed his most profound teachings. The text describes conversations between Jesus and Mary that the male disciples weren't privy to, suggesting an intimate spiritual partnership that went far beyond the teacher-student relationship depicted in canonical Gospels. What makes this text particularly remarkable is its portrayal of Mary as a teacher in her own right. When Jesus departs, the disciples are confused and frightened, but Mary comforts them and begins sharing teachings she received privately from Jesus. The other disciples initially resist her authority. Peter specifically objects to learning from a woman, but ultimately recognize that she possesses knowledge they don't have. This dynamic becomes even more significant when we consider the implications for Jesus' children. If Mary Magdalene was indeed Jesus' spiritual partner and a recipient of his private teachings, then their children would have been raised with access to wisdom traditions that never made it into official Christian doctrine. A daughter especially would have learned from her mother the feminine aspects of divine wisdom that were later systematically suppressed. The Gospel of Philip provides even more explicit evidence of the special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The text describes Jesus kissing Mary frequently and notes that he loved her more than the other disciples. While some scholars interpret this spiritually, the language used suggests intimate physical as well as spiritual connection. The Gospel also speaks of sacred marriage as a path to divine understanding, presenting physical and spiritual union as complementary rather than contradictory. Perhaps most significantly, the Gospel of Philip contains passages about divine children, offspring who inherit both human and divine nature through sacred union. While not explicitly naming Jesus and Mary's children, the theological framework presented in this text provides context for understanding how early Christian communities might have understood the spiritual significance of their descendants. The Gospel of Truth, another Nag Hammadi text, speaks extensively about divine love and the transmission of spiritual wisdom through intimate relationships. The text describes how divine knowledge can be passed through bloodline and spiritual inheritance, suggesting theological foundations for understanding how Jesus' children might have carried his spiritual legacy. These texts weren't fringe documents produced by isolated communities. Carbon dating and textual analysis indicate they were copied from even earlier sources, suggesting they preserved traditions that were mainstream in many early Christian communities before the consolidation of Orthodox doctrine. Archaeological evidence supports the historical reliability of these alternative traditions. Excavations at early Christian sites have revealed artwork and inscriptions that corroborate the prominence of women in leadership roles, the acceptance of married spiritual leaders, and the existence of alternative theological traditions that were later suppressed. The systematic suppression of these texts becomes particularly significant when we consider their implications for understanding Jesus' family life. If these Gospels preserve authentic early traditions about Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene, then their silence about children might be strategic rather than historical. In a period when followers of Jesus were being persecuted, protecting the identity and location of his descendants would have been a survival necessity. Some scholars propose that the careful preservation of these manuscripts in desert caves wasn't random, but deliberate. Communities that possessed dangerous knowledge buried it rather than see it destroyed, hoping it would survive until a time when it could safely emerge. The Nag Hammadi discovery suggests this strategy succeeded. The theological implications of these hidden Gospels extend far beyond historical curiosity. They present a version of Christianity that includes feminine spiritual authority, sacred marriage, and the possibility of divine inheritance through family rather than institutional ordination. This understanding would make Jesus' children, especially a daughter raised by Mary Magdalene, inheritors of both human and divine wisdom traditions. As we explore these ancient manuscripts that were hidden for over 15 centuries, I want to hear from you. In the comments below, share your thoughts. Do you believe these texts were deliberately excluded from the Bible? What does it mean that communities risked everything to preserve these alternative accounts of Jesus' life and relationships? Your perspective matters in this collective awakening to hidden truths. These discoveries challenge everything we've been taught about early Christianity, and your insights help build a community of people who are ready to confront uncomfortable questions about our spiritual heritage. The idea of Jesus having a wife and children isn't a modern invention or romantic fantasy. It's rooted in the cultural and religious context of first-century Judaism, where marriage was not just expected, but considered a sacred duty. Understanding this context is crucial for appreciating why traditions about Jesus' family relationships might have been preserved despite systematic suppression. In first-century Jewish culture, celibacy was virtually unknown among rabbis and religious teachers. The Hebrew Bible commands humans to be fruitful and multiply, and this wasn't interpreted as optional guidance, but as divine imperative. A unmarried rabbi in his 30s would have been so unusual as to require explanation, yet the canonical Gospels never address Jesus' marital status directly, a silence that some scholars interpret as significant. The Talmud, which preserves Jewish religious discussions from the period around Jesus' life, includes debates about whether religious study should take precedence over marriage, but ultimately concludes that marriage is the higher duty. Some rabbinical texts from this period even suggest that an unmarried teacher lacks the experiential wisdom necessary to guide others in spiritual matters. This cultural context makes the traditions about Jesus and Mary Magdalene's sacred union more plausible, not less. A Jewish spiritual teacher who chose marriage and family wouldn't have been unusual. He would have been fulfilling religious and cultural expectations. The unusual thing would be the systematic erasure of these family relationships from later Christian tradition. Biblical analysis reveals subtle but significant clues about Jesus' intimate relationships. The Gospel of John describes a beloved disciple who appears at crucial moments and is never explicitly identified. While traditional interpretation assumes this refers to John the Evangelist, some scholars propose it could refer to Mary Magdalene, especially given her prominence at the crucifixion and resurrection scenes. The wedding at Cana presents another intriguing possibility. Jesus' prominent role in this celebration, his mother's assumption that he would handle the wine shortage, and the unusually detailed account of the event have led some scholars to suggest this might have been his own wedding. The text's emphasis on the good wine, saved for last, could be interpreted symbolically as referring to the sacred nature of this particular union. Gnostic traditions preserved in various texts speak extensively about sacred marriage as a spiritual path. The concept of hieros gamos, sacred marriage, was understood not just as physical union, but as the integration of divine masculine and feminine principles. In this theological framework, Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene wouldn't have been a personal choice but a spiritual necessity, a way of embodying the divine unity he taught. The Gospel of Philip explicitly describes marriage as a sacrament that reflects divine reality. The text states that the Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism, and a Eucharist, and a redemption, and a bridal chamber. This suggests that sacred marriage was understood as one of the essential spiritual practices, not something incompatible with divine calling. Early Christian art and symbolism provide additional evidence for traditions about sacred union. Archaeological discoveries have revealed artwork from early Christian communities that depicts Jesus and Mary Magdalene in contexts suggesting intimate partnership. While this artwork was later destroyed or reinterpreted, enough survives to indicate that some early communities understood their relationship as sacred marriage. The theological implications of sacred union extend to understanding how divine nature might be transmitted to children. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene's relationship was understood as sacred marriage, the integration of divine masculine and feminine principles, then their children would have been seen as inheritors of this integrated divine nature. Some traditions preserved in esoteric communities speak of divine children born from sacred unions, offspring who carry both human and divine DNA, if you will. These children were understood to possess special spiritual gifts and responsibilities, making them both treasures to be protected and threats to be eliminated by those who wanted to control access to divine authority. The suppression of sacred marriage traditions becomes particularly significant when we consider the development of mandatory celibacy for Christian leaders. By the 4th century, the Roman Church had begun requiring celibacy for priests, effectively eliminating the possibility of spiritual authority being transmitted through family rather than institutional hierarchy. This wasn't just about moral purity, it was about power. Married priests with children represented a competing model of spiritual authority, one based on bloodline and family rather than institutional ordination. The systematic elimination of sacred marriage traditions cleared the way for exclusive institutional control over access to the divine. Understanding sacred union as a theological concept, not just a personal relationship, helps explain why Jesus and Mary Magdalene's children would have been seen as carrying unique spiritual significance, and why their existence would have posed such a threat to emerging institutional authority that their memory had to be completely erased from official history. Among the most carefully preserved traditions in European folk memory is the story of a young woman known by various names: Sarah Lakali, Sarah the Black, Sarah the Egyptian, Sarah the Dark. According to traditions maintained by Romani communities and preserved in the folklore of southern France, this Sarah was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, a child who inherited her father's spiritual gifts and her mother's wisdom, but whose very existence posed such a threat to emerging institutional power that her identity had to be hidden for over 2 millennia. The name Sarah itself carries profound significance. In Hebrew tradition, Sarah was the wife of Abraham, the mother of nations, a woman through whom divine promises were fulfilled. The choice of this name for Jesus' daughter wouldn't have been casual. It would have indicated recognition of her role in continuing divine lineage and spiritual authority. The additional designations, La Kali, the Black, the Egyptian, provide clues to both her physical appearance and her spiritual significance. In ancient Mediterranean cultures, darkness was often associated with wisdom, mystery, and divine knowledge. The Egyptian connection suggests possible education in the mystery traditions that were centered in Alexandria, where many early Christian communities sought refuge from persecution. Romani traditions, passed down through oral history for nearly 2,000 years, maintain detailed accounts of Sarah's arrival in southern France. According to these carefully preserved stories, she came with a group of refugees who fled Palestine after the crucifixion, seeking safety in communities that were beyond the reach of both Roman persecution and emerging church authority. The Romani people, often called gypsies, have been marginalized and persecuted throughout European history, but they've also served as guardians of ancient wisdom traditions that dominant cultures worked to eliminate. Their role as preservers of Sarah's memory isn't accidental. Nomadic communities were often the only ones who could maintain dangerous knowledge while staying ahead of authorities who would suppress it. French folklore, particularly in the region of Provence and the Camargue, contains numerous references to a dark-skinned holy woman who arrived from the east carrying sacred knowledge. The annual pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer, where thousands of Romani people gather to honor Sarah, represents one of the oldest continuous religious traditions in Europe, predating most official Christian celebrations in the region. Archaeological evidence in southern France supports the possibility of early Christian refugee communities establishing themselves in the region. Excavations have revealed settlements dating to the 1st century CE that show signs of Eastern Mediterranean cultural influence, suggesting migration patterns that align with traditional accounts of flight from Palestine. The spiritual significance attributed to Sarah in preserved traditions goes far beyond her parentage. According to these accounts, she possessed inherited gifts that included prophetic vision, healing abilities, and direct spiritual communication that didn't require institutional mediation. She was understood to embody the integration of her father's divine connection with her mother's earthly wisdom. Some traditions describe Sarah as continuing her mother's work as a spiritual teacher, but in hidden ways that wouldn't attract attention from authorities. She allegedly established small communities of women who preserved alternative spiritual practices, including healing traditions, mystical teachings, and forms of worship that honored both masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. The preservation of these traditions required extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Communities that maintained Sarah's memory faced persecution, not just for their religious beliefs, but for possessing knowledge that threatened the fundamental power structures of both church and state. Many paid with their lives for refusing to abandon these memories. The mystery surrounding Sarah's adult life and death adds to the significance of her story. Unlike other figures in early Christian tradition, there are no claims about her martyrdom, no stories of her public ministry, no official recognition of her spiritual authority. This absence isn't accidental. It suggests a deliberate strategy of protection that kept her identity hidden even as her influence continued. Some esoteric traditions maintain that Sarah established what could be called a hidden church, a network of communities that preserved authentic spiritual teachings while appearing to conform to orthodox requirements. These communities allegedly passed down practices and knowledge through family lines, particularly through women who could maintain traditions without attracting the attention that male religious leaders would have drawn. The genetic implications of Sarah's heritage have also been preserved in folk traditions. Communities that claimed descent from her maintained that certain spiritual gifts ran in family lines, that divine capacity could be inherited and developed through proper training and initiation. This understanding of inherited spiritual authority represented a direct challenge to institutional claims about ordination and religious hierarchy. Modern DNA analysis, while limited by the ancient time frame involved, has begun to reveal interesting patterns in populations that claim connection to Sarah's lineage. While definitive proof remains elusive, some genetic studies have identified unusual markers in Mediterranean and Romani populations that suggest common ancestry dating to the 1st century CE. The emotional and spiritual impact of Sarah's story extends far beyond historical curiosity. For many people, particularly women who feel excluded from traditional religious authority, Sarah represents proof that feminine spiritual leadership has ancient roots, that divine authority was never meant to be exclusively masculine, that the sacred feminine wasn't invented by modern movements, but was systematically suppressed by institutional power. Understanding Sarah Lakali as Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter reframes our entire understanding of early Christianity. Instead of a religion founded by a celibate teacher who left only spiritual children, we see a tradition that included biological family, inherited spiritual gifts, and ongoing divine presence through bloodline as well as belief. Her story suggests that what we call Christianity might have developed very differently if Sarah's lineage had been acknowledged rather than suppressed, if feminine spiritual authority had been preserved rather than eliminated, if family-based transmission of divine wisdom had been maintained rather than replaced by institutional control. The traditional account of the flight to France reads like an ancient thriller. A small group of Jesus's closest followers, including pregnant Mary Magdalene, escape Palestine in the chaos following the crucifixion and resurrection. Their destination was the wild coast of southern France, where they could establish new communities beyond the reach of both Roman persecution and emerging religious orthodoxy that was already beginning to suppress alternative accounts of Jesus's life and teaching. According to carefully preserved traditions, the escape was meticulously planned. Early Christian communities had established networks throughout the Mediterranean that could provide safe passage for refugees fleeing persecution. These networks included both Jewish communities in the diaspora and sympathetic Gentile converts who understood the danger facing Jesus's immediate family and closest associates. The route traditionally described follows ancient trading paths that connected the eastern Mediterranean with Gaul. Ships from Palestine would have sailed to Alexandria, then along the North African coast to ports in what is now Spain or southern France. This journey, while dangerous, was well established and would have offered multiple opportunities to transfer between vessels and avoid detection by Roman authorities. French folklore from the region around Marseille preserves detailed accounts of the arrival of the holy women from the east. These traditions, maintained independently in multiple communities, describe a group of refugees that included Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Mary Jacobi, and a young dark-skinned woman they protected with extraordinary care. Local legends speak of their boat arriving without sails or oars, guided by divine providence to a safe landing. The choice of southern France as a destination wasn't random. The region was known for its tolerance of religious diversity, its distance from Roman administrative centers, and its established communities of Eastern immigrants who could provide both cover and support for the refugees. The wild landscape of the Camargue offered perfect hiding places for people who needed to remain invisible while establishing new communities. Archaeological evidence supports the possibility of 1st century Middle Eastern settlement in the region. Excavations have revealed artifacts, architectural styles, and cultural practices that suggest significant Eastern Mediterranean influence during this period. While not definitive proof of the specific refuge tradition, these discoveries create a historical context that makes the traditional accounts plausible. The emotional trauma of the escape must have been overwhelming. These were people who had witnessed the crucifixion, experienced the resurrection, and then faced the terrifying reality that their continued presence in Palestine endangered not only themselves, but the entire early Christian movement. For Mary Magdalene, pregnant with or caring for a young child, the journey represented not just physical danger, but the challenge of protecting the next generation of divine heritage. The decision to separate and hide would have been particularly agonizing. Traditional accounts suggest that the refugees deliberately scattered upon reaching France, with different members of the group establishing communities in different regions to minimize the risk of being discovered and eliminated together. This separation meant that people who had shared the most profound spiritual experiences in human history had to live the rest of their lives in isolation from each other. For Sarah, if she was indeed carried to France as a child, the experience would have shaped her entire understanding of identity and mission. She would have grown up knowing that her very existence was dangerous, that powerful forces would kill her if they discovered who she was, but also that she carried responsibilities and gifts that couldn't be abandoned or ignored. The establishment of hidden communities in France created the foundation for preserving traditions that would otherwise have been lost. These communities developed sophisticated methods for maintaining dangerous knowledge while appearing to conform to orthodox requirements. They created dual-level teaching systems where surface instruction appeared conventional while deeper wisdom was reserved for carefully vetted initiates. The psychological impact of living with hidden identity would have been enormous. Community members had to develop extraordinary skills in maintaining false identities, protecting dangerous knowledge, and recognizing others who shared their secret understanding. This created a subculture of spiritual resistance that survived for centuries despite systematic persecution. The French refuge becomes even more significant when we consider how it positioned Sarah's descendants. Unlike Palestine, where Christian communities faced immediate persecution, or Rome, where orthodoxy was being enforced, France offered space for alternative traditions to survive and develop. This geographic distance from the centers of institutional power created the breathing room necessary for preserving authentic memories of Jesus' family and teaching. Throughout European history, certain communities risked everything to preserve the memory of Sarah and her lineage. These weren't mainstream religious groups or powerful institutions. They were marginalized communities, secret societies, and mystical traditions that understood they were protecting knowledge so dangerous that discovery meant death, but so precious that abandonment meant spiritual catastrophe. The Knights Templar, perhaps the most famous of these guardian communities, emerged in the 12th century with a mission that officially involved protecting Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. But historical analysis suggests their true purpose may have been far more complex. Archaeological evidence from Templar sites reveals artifacts and symbols that indicate deep knowledge of pre-Christian spiritual traditions, Gnostic theology, and mystical practices that were considered heretical by mainstream Christianity. Some scholars propose that the Templars possessed documents or relics related to Jesus' family that they discovered during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The extraordinary wealth and power they accumulated in such a short time, their sophisticated understanding of international finance and politics, and their eventual persecution by both church and state suggest they possessed leverage that went far beyond military capability. The Cathars of southern France represent another community that may have served as guardians of dangerous knowledge. These perfect ones maintained beliefs about sacred marriage, feminine spiritual authority, and direct divine communication that directly contradicted orthodox doctrine. Their systematic extermination during the Albigensian Crusade wasn't just about theological differences, it was about eliminating communities that preserved alternative memories of early Christianity. Historical records from the Cathar persecution reveal that inquisitors were particularly interested in finding books, documents, and oral traditions that these communities had preserved. The violence of their suppression, entire cities burned, populations massacred, libraries destroyed, suggests that what they protected was considered existentially threatening to institutional Christianity. The Romani people, often called gypsies, have served as perhaps the most effective guardians of Sarah's memory. Their nomadic lifestyle allowed them to preserve traditions while staying ahead of authorities who would suppress them. Their annual pilgrimage to Sainte-Marie de la Mer in southern France, where they venerate Sarah la Kali, represents one of the oldest continuous religious observances in Europe. Romani oral traditions preserve remarkably detailed accounts of Sarah's life, her spiritual gifts, and her descendants. These stories, passed down through generations despite centuries of persecution, maintain that Sarah possessed inherited abilities including prophecy, healing, and direct spiritual communication. More significantly, they preserve genealogical knowledge about families that claim descent from her lineage. Folk traditions throughout Europe contain echoes of hidden royal bloodlines, secret spiritual authority, and feminine wisdom that was preserved outside official religious channels. The persistence of these themes across cultures and centuries suggests they reflect historical memories rather than fantasy, cultural DNA that preserved truth even when conscious knowledge was suppressed. Medieval alchemical and mystical traditions developed sophisticated symbolic languages for preserving dangerous knowledge. The concept of the Grail family, the sacred bloodline, the hidden princess, the dark Madonna, these weren't literary inventions, but coded references to actual historical realities that could only be discussed in symbols and metaphors. The survival strategies developed by guardian communities were extraordinarily sophisticated. They created dual-level teaching systems where surface instruction appeared orthodox, while deeper wisdom was reserved for carefully initiated members. They developed recognition signals, safe houses, and communication networks that allowed them to identify and support each other across vast geographic distances. The psychological burden carried by these guardian communities cannot be overstated. They lived with the knowledge that they possessed information that could transform human understanding of spirituality and religious authority, but also that revealing this knowledge would result in their immediate destruction. This created generations of people who carried profound spiritual responsibility while living in constant danger. Some esoteric traditions maintain that guardian communities established what could be called schools of hidden wisdom, where carefully selected individuals could learn preserved teachings. These schools allegedly taught not just historical knowledge about Jesus' family, but also the spiritual practices and mystical techniques that had been developed by his descendants and followers. The influence of these guardian traditions extended far beyond their own communities. Renaissance artists, writers, and thinkers who were initiated into these mysteries embedded hidden references to Sarah and her lineage in their work. Leonardo da Vinci's paintings, for example, contain symbolic elements that some scholars interpret as references to feminine spiritual authority and sacred bloodline. Modern archaeological discoveries have begun to validate some of the knowledge preserved by guardian communities. Sites that were identified in ancient traditions as significant have yielded artifacts and evidence that corroborate historical claims that mainstream scholarship had dismissed as fantasy. This suggests that oral traditions maintained by marginalized communities may be more historically accurate than official academic accounts. The digital age has created new opportunities for guardian knowledge to emerge safely. Communities that maintained dangerous traditions in secret for centuries can now share information globally without the geographic constraints that once made them vulnerable to systematic persecution. This has led to an unprecedented convergence of preserved traditions from around the world. Contemporary genetic research has also begun to identify patterns that support some guardian claims about inherited spiritual gifts and family lineages. While the science is still developing, preliminary studies suggest that certain abilities traditionally associated with spiritual giftedness may indeed have genetic components that can be traced through family lines. The courage required to serve as guardians of this knowledge deserves recognition. These communities faced centuries of persecution, torture, and death rather than abandon their responsibility to preserve truth. Their sacrifice ensured that knowledge about Sarah and her significance survived to emerge in our time, when it can finally be shared without immediate threat of violent suppression. I want to see how far this awakening has spread across our planet. In the comments below, tell me, from which country are you watching this video? Are there traditions in your culture about hidden spiritual knowledge, sacred bloodlines, or feminine spiritual authority that was suppressed by institutional religion? Let's map this global rediscovery of hidden truths together. Your heritage might contain pieces of this puzzle that have been preserved in ways we haven't yet discovered. While documentary evidence of Jesus' family was systematically destroyed or hidden, archaeological discoveries in recent decades have begun to provide physical corroboration for traditions that academic scholarship had dismissed as folklore. These findings don't offer definitive proof, but they create a historical context that makes preserved traditions about Sarah and her lineage more plausible than previously believed. Excavations in southern France have revealed extensive evidence of first-century Middle Eastern settlement in regions traditionally associated with the arrival of Christian refugees. Archaeological sites near Marseille and throughout Provence show artifacts, architectural styles, and cultural practices that indicate significant immigration from Palestine and the broader Eastern Mediterranean during the decades following the crucifixion. Carbon dating of materials from these sites consistently places the establishment of these communities in the 1st century CE, aligning precisely with traditional accounts of when Mary Magdalene and her companions arrived in France. While this doesn't prove the specific identities of the refugees, it confirms that the historical context for their escape existed. Particularly intriguing are discoveries of religious artifacts that show fusion between Jewish, early Christian, and local Gallic spiritual traditions. These hybrid religious objects suggest communities that were maintaining Eastern practices while adapting to local customs, exactly what would be expected from refugees who needed to blend in while preserving their spiritual heritage. Genetic studies of European populations have revealed unexpected patterns that may support traditions about hidden bloodlines. Research into Romani populations in particular has identified genetic markers that suggest ancient Middle Eastern ancestry, consistent with oral traditions about their role in preserving Sarah's lineage. While genetic evidence from 2 millennia ago remains limited, these studies provide intriguing hints about population movements that align with preserved historical accounts. Archaeological investigations at sites associated with early Christian communities have uncovered evidence of practices that were later suppressed by Orthodox Christianity. Excavations have revealed artifacts suggesting that early Christian worship included feminine spiritual authority, sacred marriage ceremonies, and mystical practices that disappeared from mainstream Christianity but were preserved in esoteric traditions. Recent discoveries in Palestine itself have begun to challenge orthodox assumptions about early Christian communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that Jesus' followers were more diverse in their beliefs and practices than canonical accounts indicate, and that women played more prominent roles in leadership than later church tradition acknowledged. Particularly significant are discoveries related to 1st century Jewish marriage and family practices. Archaeological evidence confirms that celibacy was virtually unknown among Jewish religious teachers of Jesus' era, supporting the plausibility of traditions about his marriage and family. Wedding artifacts, family tomb inscriptions, and domestic religious objects all point to a culture where spiritual leadership and family life were understood as complementary rather than contradictory. Excavations at early Christian sites throughout the Mediterranean have revealed artwork and symbols that corroborate the prominence of women in early Christianity. Mosaics, frescoes, and carved reliefs show women in priestly roles, teaching positions, and positions of spiritual authority that were later eliminated from official church tradition. Scientific analysis of ancient manuscripts has also provided new insights into the suppression of alternative Christian traditions. Spectroscopic analysis and advanced imaging techniques have revealed text that was deliberately obscured or written over, suggesting systematic efforts to eliminate references to Jesus' family relationships and feminine spiritual authority. Archaeological investigation of sites associated with the Knights Templar has yielded artifacts that suggest deep knowledge of pre-Christian spiritual traditions and mystical practices. While the full significance of these discoveries remains debated, they indicate that medieval guardian communities possessed sophisticated understanding of ancient spiritual traditions that went far beyond conventional Christian theology. Modern archaeological techniques have also begun to investigate sites identified in folk traditions as significant to Sarah's story. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive methods have revealed underground structures and burial sites in locations that oral tradition had identified as important, suggesting that preserved memories may be more historically accurate than previously assumed. The convergence of archaeological evidence with preserved traditions creates a compelling case for reconsidering dismissed historical accounts. While individual discoveries might be explained as coincidence, the accumulating pattern of evidence suggests that communities who maintained dangerous knowledge about Jesus' family may have been preserving authentic historical memories rather than creating fantasy narratives. These archaeological whispers don't provide definitive answers, but they create space for asking questions that were previously dismissed as unscholarly. They suggest that the truth about Jesus' family may be more complex and more hidden than Orthodox tradition acknowledges, and that recovery of this truth requires listening to voices that mainstream scholarship has traditionally ignored. To understand why the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter had to be completely erased from history, we must examine what her existence represented to the institutional church that was consolidating power in the centuries following Christ's death. Sarah wasn't just an inconvenient family relationship. She embodied every threat to patriarchal religious authority that the Roman Church was working to eliminate. The development of papal supremacy required establishing the exclusive authority of male clergy to mediate between humanity and the divine. This system could only function if spiritual authority flowed through institutional ordination rather than through blood inheritance, personal revelation, or feminine wisdom traditions. A daughter who inherited both divine nature and spiritual authority outside ecclesiastical control represented an existential threat to this entire power structure. Historical analysis of early church documents reveals consistent patterns of suppressing any suggestion that spiritual authority could be transmitted through family lineage. The celibacy requirements that were gradually imposed on clergy weren't just about moral purity. They were about ensuring that religious authority couldn't be passed from father to son, creating competing dynasties that might challenge papal control. Sarah's existence was particularly threatening because she represented the convergence of multiple dangers to institutional power. As a woman, she challenged the exclusion of feminine spiritual authority. As Jesus' daughter, she possessed inherited divine credentials that surpassed any ordination. As Mary Magdalene's child, she carried the legacy of a woman who had been recognized as a spiritual teacher in her own right. Vatican secret archives, while largely inaccessible to researchers, have occasionally yielded documents that reveal the Church's historical awareness of competing claims to spiritual authority. Medieval papal correspondence includes references to false bloodlines and heretical family claims that had to be suppressed, suggesting that knowledge about Jesus' descendants persisted long enough to require active countermeasures. The systematic persecution of communities that preserved alternative Christian traditions becomes more understandable when viewed as efforts to eliminate knowledge about Jesus' family. The Cathar Crusade, the Templar suppression, the Inquisition, all targeted groups that maintained beliefs about sacred marriage, feminine spiritual authority, and bloodline inheritance of divine gifts. The theological implications of acknowledging Jesus' daughter would have been catastrophic for developing Catholic doctrine. If Jesus had children, then his fully human nature would be undeniable, challenging emerging beliefs about his otherworldly status. If spiritual authority could be inherited through bloodline, then the entire apparatus of clerical hierarchy would be exposed as a human construction rather than divine mandate. The suppression required extraordinary coordination between religious and secular authorities. Civil laws were enacted that made claiming descent from Jesus a capital offense. Religious doctrine was developed that made belief in Jesus' family relationships heretical. Cultural narratives were constructed that associated such claims with madness or blasphemy. The economic implications were equally significant. The Catholic Church was accumulating vast wealth and temporal power that depended on its exclusive claims to spiritual authority. Communities that maintained alternative traditions often operated outside church control, creating parallel economic and social structures that competed with institutional Christianity. The psychological warfare against Sarah's memory was particularly sophisticated. By transforming Mary Magdalene from apostle to prostitute, church authorities eliminated the possibility of a respectable maternal lineage. By emphasizing Jesus' otherworldly nature, they made the idea of his having children seem spiritually inappropriate. By associating claims about hidden bloodlines with fantasy and heresy, they discredited anyone who maintained such traditions. Modern Vatican policies continue to reflect institutional sensitivity about these issues. Documents related to early Christian history remain classified or restricted. Archaeological investigations in Vatican-controlled sites are limited, and official church positions on women's roles and clerical celibacy maintain policies that would be threatened by acknowledging feminine spiritual authority or inherited religious calling. The fear wasn't just about losing authority. It was about the collapse of an entire worldview that had taken centuries to construct. Acknowledging Sarah would mean admitting that the Church had built its power on the suppression of truth, that alternative forms of spiritual authority were legitimate, and that the institutional mediation they claimed as essential was actually optional. The persistence of this fear into modern times is evident in the Church's responses to popular culture that explores these themes. The reaction to works like the Da Vinci Code, while often dismissive, reveals continued sensitivity about public interest in these suppressed traditions. The effort to debunk such explorations often seems disproportionate to their actual theological threat, suggesting that institutional anxiety about these questions remains acute. Understanding the Vatican's fear illuminates why recovery of Sarah's story is so significant in our time. It represents not just historical correction, but spiritual liberation, the recovery of divine inheritance that belongs to humanity as a whole, rather than to institutional gatekeepers who have used artificial scarcity to maintain control over access to the sacred. The revelation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter isn't just ancient history. It's a catalyst for spiritual awakening that speaks directly to the deepest hunger of our time, the longing for authentic divine connection that doesn't require institutional permission, patriarchal mediation, or the abandonment of our full humanity in service of otherworldly spirituality. Sarah's story offers profound healing for the artificial divisions that have fractured human spiritual experience for nearly 2 millennia. The suppression of her memory forced Christianity to choose between spirit and flesh, between sacred and secular, between masculine and feminine divine principles. Her recovery suggests the possibility of integration, of wholeness, of spirituality that embraces rather than transcends human experience. For women especially, Sarah represents the restoration of feminine spiritual authority that was systematically erased from religious tradition. She embodies the possibility that divine wisdom can flow through feminine consciousness, that spiritual leadership isn't limited to masculine expression, that the sacred feminine isn't a modern invention, but an ancient heritage that was stolen and can be reclaimed. The theological implications extend far beyond gender roles to fundamental questions about the nature of divine inheritance. If Sarah possessed inherited spiritual gifts, if divine capacity can flow through bloodline as well as belief, then every human being potentially carries sacred heritage that doesn't depend on institutional validation or religious gatekeeping. This understanding transforms the meaning of Christ consciousness from exclusive divine status to shared human potential. Instead of Jesus being the only divine human, he becomes the first of a lineage, the initiator of a spiritual DNA that was meant to spread throughout humanity rather than being contained within institutional structures. Sarah's story also offers healing for the wounded relationship between sexuality and spirituality that has characterized Western religion for centuries. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene's sacred union produced a daughter who inherited divine gifts, then physical love becomes a pathway to, rather than an obstacle to, spiritual connection. The integration of body and spirit, passion and devotion, becomes not just acceptable, but sacred. Contemporary spiritual seekers who have felt alienated from institutional religion often discover in Sarah's story validation for their intuitive understanding that authentic spirituality is more inclusive, more feminine, more embodied than orthodox tradition acknowledges. Her memory offers permission to trust inner knowing over external authority, to seek direct divine connection rather than mediated spiritual experience. The psychological healing potential of this revelation addresses deep wounds in collective human consciousness. The suppression of Sarah represents the suppression of the feminine divine, the marginalization of intuitive wisdom, the devaluation of emotional and relational ways of knowing that have been dismissed as inferior to rational and hierarchical approaches to spirituality. Recognition of Sarah's heritage suggests that spiritual gifts traditionally associated with women, intuition, healing, emotional wisdom, relational understanding, aren't consolation prizes for being excluded from real religious authority, but are themselves expressions of divine inheritance that was present from the beginning of Christianity. The implications for understanding inherited spiritual capacity challenge modern assumptions about the democratization of divine gifts. While contemporary spirituality often emphasizes that everyone has equal access to spiritual development, Sarah's story suggests that some individuals and families may carry particular concentrations of divine capacity that create both special gifts and special responsibilities. This doesn't create spiritual hierarchy based on bloodline, but it does suggest that divine inheritance operates through family systems as well as individual seeking. Children raised by spiritually gifted parents, communities that maintain wisdom traditions across generations, and cultures that preserve mystical practices may serve as reservoirs of spiritual capacity that benefit all humanity. The emergence of Sarah's story in our time isn't coincidental, but synchronistic, appearing when global consciousness is ready to integrate the truths her memory preserves. The contemporary awakening to feminine spiritual authority, the healing of religious trauma, the search for authentic rather than institutional spirituality all create context for understanding why her story is surfacing now. Environmental and social crises that threaten human survival have created urgent need for the integrated wisdom that Sarah represents. The separation of spirit from matter, the devaluation of feminine wisdom, the emphasis on hierarchy over cooperation, all the patterns that required her suppression, have contributed to creating the crises that now threaten planetary survival. The spiritual awakening catalyzed by Sarah's story offers practical as well as mystical transformation. Recognition of feminine spiritual authority empowers women to trust their intuitive wisdom in addressing social and environmental challenges. Understanding of inherited spiritual capacity encourages the development of family and community wisdom traditions. Integration of sacred and secular consciousness supports approaches to social change that work with rather than against natural and spiritual principles. Personal spiritual practice informed by Sarah's story emphasizes direct divine connection over institutional mediation, integrative rather than transcendent approaches to spiritual development, and the cultivation of inherited gifts rather than the abandonment of human capacity in service of otherworldly goals. The recovery of Sarah's memory also supports the development of spiritual communities that honor both individual authenticity and collective wisdom, that integrate masculine and feminine leadership, that maintain connection to ancestral wisdom while adapting to contemporary needs. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's story offers hope for the healing of Christianity itself, the possibility that this tradition could recover its original integration of divine and human, masculine and feminine, spiritual and embodied consciousness. Instead of abandoning Christianity as irredeemably patriarchal, her memory suggests the possibility of restoration and renewal. The spiritual awakening catalyzed by understanding Sarah's significance ultimately points toward the greatest healing of all, the recognition that divine inheritance belongs to all humanity, that spiritual authority doesn't require institutional permission, and that the sacred feminine and masculine principles were meant to work in partnership rather than hierarchy to serve the evolution of consciousness and the healing of our world. As we reach the conclusion of this journey into forbidden history, we stand at a crossroads that extends far beyond academic curiosity or historical revelation. The story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's daughter represents more than hidden knowledge. It's a call to spiritual courage, an invitation to reclaim heritage that was stolen from our collective consciousness, and a challenge to live in alignment with truths that transform everything we thought we knew about our spiritual potential. The suppression of Sarah's memory required the combined efforts of empire and institution, the systematic destruction of libraries and communities, the persecution of countless individuals who chose truth over safety. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain, because the knowledge they died to preserve has survived. It survived in manuscripts buried in desert caves, in oral traditions maintained by marginalized communities, in folk memories and artistic symbols that preserved what couldn't be spoken directly. Now that survival creates responsibility, we who live in times when this knowledge can emerge safely carry the obligation to honor those who preserved it, to continue the work they began, to ensure that the truth they protected isn't lost again to indifference, ridicule, or the comfortable assumption that challenging established narratives isn't worth the effort. The implications of Sarah's story extend into every area of human experience. In a world where women still struggle for recognition of their spiritual authority, her memory provides evidence that feminine divine connection has ancient roots and legitimate claims. In a time when sexuality and spirituality are still often viewed as contradictory, her existence proves that sacred union was understood as a pathway to, rather than an obstacle to, divine connection. For those who have felt alienated from institutional religion, Sarah's story offers the possibility of reclaiming Christian heritage without accepting patriarchal distortions. She represents Christianity before it was captured by empire, spirituality before it was constrained by institutional control, divine inheritance before it was limited to ordained hierarchy. The courage required to embrace these truths shouldn't be underestimated. Acknowledging that we've been systematically lied to about our spiritual heritage means confronting the possibility that other foundational assumptions about reality might also be constructed rather than revealed. It means accepting responsibility for spiritual development that doesn't depend on external authority or institutional permission, but the rewards of this courage are extraordinary. Recognition of Sarah's heritage opens doorways to spiritual possibilities that have been closed for nearly 2 millennia. It suggests that divine gifts are more widely distributed than we've been taught, that spiritual authority belongs to humanity as a birthright rather than as an institutional privilege, that the sacred feminine and masculine principles were meant to work in partnership for the healing and evolution of consciousness. The timing of this revelation isn't accidental. We live in a moment when global consciousness is ready to integrate truths that previous generations couldn't safely embrace. The information age has created unprecedented opportunities for suppressed knowledge to emerge and spread beyond the reach of traditional gatekeepers. The environmental and social crises facing humanity have created urgent need for the integrated wisdom that Sarah's story represents. Contemporary spiritual awakening is characterized by the search for authentic, rather than institutional connection to the divine, by the recognition of feminine spiritual authority, by the integration of embodied and transcendent approaches to consciousness development. Sarah's story provides historical foundation and spiritual permission for all of these developments. The healing potential extends beyond individual spiritual development to collective transformation. Communities that embrace the principles represented by Sarah's heritage, partnership rather than hierarchy, integration rather than separation, inherited wisdom rather than institutional control, create models for addressing the social and environmental challenges that threaten human survival. The responsibility that comes with this knowledge includes not just personal transformation, but collective action. Those who understand the significance of Sarah's story are called to support the emergence of spiritual communities that honor both feminine and masculine wisdom, to challenge systems that maintain artificial scarcity around access to the divine, to preserve and transmit this knowledge to future generations who will continue the work of integration and healing. The global nature of contemporary awakening means that this knowledge is emerging simultaneously in communities around the world, creating opportunities for coordination and mutual support that weren't available to previous generations of truth keepers. The isolation that characterized guardian communities for centuries is being replaced by networks of individuals and groups who can share resources, insights, and protection. Personal spiritual practice informed by Sarah's story emphasizes direct divine connection, the development of inherited gifts, and the integration of sacred and secular consciousness. It supports approaches to spiritual development that honor both individual authenticity and collective wisdom, that maintain connection to ancestral knowledge while adapting to contemporary needs. The ultimate significance of Sarah's revelation lies not in historical vindication, but in spiritual liberation. Her story breaks the artificial constraints that have limited human understanding of divine inheritance, spiritual authority, and sacred relationship. It opens possibilities for spiritual development that honors the full spectrum of human experience while connecting us to sources of wisdom and power that transcend individual limitation. The call to truth that Sarah's story represents requires not just intellectual acceptance, but embodied commitment. It asks us to live as if divine inheritance were our birthright, to act as if spiritual authority didn't require institutional permission, to love as if sacred union were possible, to teach as if wisdom could be transmitted through relationship as well as doctrine. This isn't comfortable knowledge. It challenges fundamental assumptions about authority, spirituality, and human potential. But it's necessary knowledge for anyone who feels called to participate in the consciousness evolution that our world desperately needs. If this journey has awakened something within you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications, because we're just beginning to uncover the secrets they thought were buried forever. This isn't just information, it's invitation to reclaim spiritual heritage that belongs to all humanity. Click on the next video that appears on your screen, because each revelation builds upon the last, and your awakening is just beginning. Together, we're reclaiming the truth they tried to silence, recovering the wisdom they attempted to destroy, and rebuilding understanding that was deliberately shattered. The daughter they tried to erase from history lives on through our willingness to remember, to question, to seek, and to share the truth that sets consciousness free. Thank you for watching this video until the end. See you in the next video.